close. Oh, when death had tried to take me in. Oh, but the reason I'm here, it's so easy to see. In fact, it's so easy to explain. God's grace, God's grace, God's grace, God's grace, God's grace, God's grace. It's amazing grace. His grace is amazing. I mean, point to yourself. I mean, this far by the grace.